We need to put some elevator music on in the background or something for these long, quiet sessions here.
I was meditating, as I often do. We'll just,
I can put my kid playing dinosaurs on if you want.
There you go, Jamin.
we'll just give it another minute. It looks like there's a couple, three that might still join us, hopefully. Looks like we do have a quorum though, regardless.
Mayor Swadley, this is Dennis from Ford Development Group.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, good. I think I'm appearing as WS. I don't have a camera.
Yeah, your voice changed.
Yeah.
All right, well, I guess we'll get started here. We have enough, so we'll see if others join us. So we'll start the meeting. Good evening. It's Monday, December 14th of 2020. This is the Stoughton Plan Commission meeting. As I mentioned, we do have a quorum, so we'll begin the meeting. The first item on the agenda is the consideration of the approval of the Plan Commission meeting minutes of November 9th, 2020. And I would entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Oh, second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion on the minutes? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
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 And any opposed? None opposed. The minutes are approved. Next item is the council representative report. Alderperson Caravello, anything to report?
Just essentially one thing, at last council meeting, ordinance 26 of 2020, repealing zoning code section 78-205 parentheses 12 was approved. And that's it.
All right, thank you. Next item is the staff development reports. Anything to highlight?
One item I think I'd highlight is we had indicated Madison powder coating project was canceled at that time. Sounds like there might be some renewed interest in the ability for them to put the addition on their building. They're also showing some interest in one of the other parcels the city owns at this point. So some potentially good news for a local company looking to expand. So we're happy to hear that that might proceed.
Any questions on the staff developments? Hearing none. Next item would be to set a public hearing date regarding a TIF 4 allocation amendment to donate excess increment to TIF 5 and TIF 8. And I know we have a couple special guests on here tonight. Who would like to start, Jamin or Ryan?
I can take it over. I'm Ryan Weeson, by the way. We have TIF 4's expenditure period is ending March 21st, and all the project costs are expected to be recovered by then. So under state law, we would be required to close it. But there is an option if we approve what's called an allocation amendment before March, that we would be able to donate excess funds to other TIDs that are distressed. Specifically, TIF 5 and TIF 8 could use some funds. We're projecting over the next 6 years, we'd be able to collect increment and be able to donate about $1 million to those TIFs, projecting about 750,000 give or take for TIF 8 and for TIF 5 and about 250,000 for TIF 8. They would be used to limit how much the city will have to potentially either loan those TIFs are subsidized through regular property taxes. The basic process is Eller's working on an allocation amendment to prepare it for approval. For tonight, the main thing we just need to do is to have the Plan Commission make a motion to call for a public hearing on January 11th. On January 11th at 5:30, the Joint Review Board will review that allocation amendment plan and set a meeting date for the future. And then the Plan Commission after that can also review the amendment and approve it. And then it would go to the City Council the next night for approval as well. You have any questions on it at all, or? It's pretty straightforward. There's no major disadvantages to it that I'm aware of.
Any questions from commissioners? If none, I guess I would entertain that motion to set that meeting date. You said it was January 11th at 5:30?
6 p.m. at the Plan Commission. The 5:30 is Joint Review Board.
Oh, okay. Is there a commissioner willing to make a motion to that effect?
Make a motion to set the January 11th date, 6 p.m.
Is there a second?
And I will second that.
All right, thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And any opposed? None opposed, that motion carries. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you.
Next
Mayor,
item.
this is Todd. Just wanted, for the attendance purposes, say that I'm on the phone.
Okay, you're showing up as caller number 2. So I'll get you set up here. Next item is a request by Mike Molling to amend the zoning ordinance section 78-722, parent 7, swimming pool standards. And this one had been on previous agendas, and due to scheduling conflicts, we haven't taken action on it. We did have some internal discussion. One of our city attorneys, Rachel Snyder, is at the meeting as well, if we have any questions regarding this. And then I know she's here for some other topics as well. Anything to update, Rodney?
Yeah, certainly. I think this staff, along with the city attorney's office, have tried to peruse this entire section related to fencing for pool enclosures and have some recommended changes in the draft that's in your packet. You will recall there was certainly significant interest in retaining language for a self-closing, self-latching gate that would accompany any pool enclosure, even above ground pools. So an above ground pool, while it might have the fencing standard met for the height of the pool wall plus an additional fence above that, the entrance to that fence or to the above ground pool area would still have to have some type of self-closing, self-latching gate arrangement. So it might require a small segment of boxed in fencing, if you will, to accommodate that before there would be a ladder that could go up in the case that we've shown on the screen before. But I think we've tried to accomplish what we understood the guidance from the Plan Commission was in the previous discussion. More than happy to talk about specifics or try to answer any questions related to that. So recognize a few other clarifications we did within this entire code section to clarify definitions and things within this section. We didn't think they were substantive, but certainly things that clarified a couple of minor things within the section 722.
Any initial thoughts or questions from commissioners? And I know Vike is here as well, so if Vike has any feedback, certainly would be happy to hear that as well.
Mayor, this is Todd.
Yeah, go ahead.
I really like the changes that were in our packets. I think it's looking really good to me. I know when I talked to Michael Stacy in between meetings, he had expressed concern sometimes those self-closing, self-latching devices aren't maintained. But that's something that is, I think it's still important to have in the ordinance. The only place I think that there might be a little bit of tweaking that still needs to be done is under 7, compliance. The very first sentence, either I'm not reading it right or there's something missing in there for clarity. It's the part where it says, or when water is placed in the pool at the end there. It seems like something's missing. But other than that, I think everything looks really good.
Any other comments specific to this number 7, as long as we're on it?
I'll read it out loud, and you guys tell me if it seems like something's missing for you guys. It says all swimming pools existing at the time of passage of this chapter not satisfactorily fenced shall comply with the fencing requirements of this section, or when water is placed in the pool. Unless it is referring to all swimming pools existing at the time of this passage of this chapter, or when water is placed in the pool. It's throwing me on what exactly the last part there is referring to.
So I think
Does
that's
it?
suggesting that if there's currently water in the pool, is that how I would read it? It would have to be in compliance, or when they fill the pool, say in the spring. I think that's how I read the intent. Did you have anything, Director Shield, or?
I think you've characterized it properly. Obviously, if there's a pool and area that's a pool that's not filled with water at this point, I think overall we still want the enclosure, but I think this would recognize that if it didn't have water at the time when the water was placed in, it would have to be in a full compliance with the regulations.
Yeah, my understanding is some pools you just don't want to drain because it'll ruin the liner, and other pools maybe they empty out at the end of the season. Is there some suggested language that you think will help make that more user friendly?
If it's what you're referring to, which makes sense, then I think you might need something like after the word section, some kind of time frame. So it might be immediately. In other words, all swimming pools existing at the time of the passage of this chapter not satisfactorily fenced shall comply with the fencing requirements of this section immediately, or when water is placed in the pool. But I'm saying that there's just something missing there between section and or like some kind of time frame.
Mayor, do you mind if I jump in?
Sure, go ahead, Attorney Schneider.
So I would just suggest that this chapter's been in existence for a while, so you probably don't have any more pools in existence at the time of the chapter. You could probably pull that out and just say when you want the fencing to be in place, which is, it sounds to me like when there's water in the pool. This looks to me like it was something to sort of capture already existing pools, sort of a retroactive application.
So maybe if we just got rid of the or, if we got rid of the or in that sentence, then it would say they need to fulfill the fence requirements of this section when water is placed in the pool.
You could essentially get rid of the at the time of the passage of this chapter, part 2, and just say, yeah, all swimming pools shall be satisfactorily fenced in compliance with this chapter when there is water in the pool, if that's what your intent is.
Yeah.
Well, if instead you are maybe concerned about an empty pool that's essentially an in-ground pool, perhaps that's a giant hole in the ground, maybe you do want fencing around something like that even when there's not water there. I think that's just something for your consideration.
Any other comments on that one from any other commissioners?
Mayor,
So-
could I just chime in there real quick on something?
Sure.
I thought there was a 4 foot, 4 feet of water in an above ground pool that triggers the requirement for fencing. I don't have the ordinance in front of me right now, but I don't know if that, isn't that true, Mike, that 4 feet was of water was a trigger?
I think it's 36 inches.
Oh, okay.
It's under item number 2. Is that what you're referring to?
I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but I thought that there was a trigger there if you have 4 feet of water, or more than 4 feet of water, then you have to comply with all these fencing requirements for an above ground pool. And
Under this standard, anything with 36 inches of water requires the fencing standards.
oh, okay.
And I guess the question is would it only be required if there's water in the pool?
Right, and I guess I'm reading these definitions to say that essentially a pool is something that has the capacity to have that much water.
Correct. That's correct.
Not necessarily that the fencing requirements are triggered by the presence of that much water. And so the
Okay,
question
thank you.
in the compliance paragraph is whether you want to condition compliance on the presence of water or not.
I think there should be an intent to not condition it upon the depth of the water. Because I think it's difficult to evaluate whether somebody has it filled above 36 inches. If it's a pool that can hold 5 or 6 feet, yet they keep in their own minds the water level at 36 inches, seems, definitely difficult to monitor. I think the intent would be to have those areas fenced if the pool would have the ability to contain more than 36-inch water depth.
So where are we suggesting the language change then?
I think the only place that you might want to consider is the compliance section. I think the other section above is pretty clear, the 36 inches. I really think you could probably just have the first sentence say all swimming pools not satisfactorily fenced shall comply with the fencing requirements section. Essentially, they need to all comply at this point, right? We're suggesting that there really isn't any grandfathered situations out there. So prior to water being placed in any of these, the fencing standard has to be put in place. We might want to wordsmith that a little more. It might take a minute to really think about how that might be changed.
I would agree, but I think it might be that you could remove that first sentence entirely and then just start with the second sentence. Enclosures on pools shall be inspected by the zoning administrator for compliance. And then you might be really close just with that, because if it's all pools that need to abide, but yeah, we can probably wordsmith this outside, but that's everything else looks great to me.
All right. So do you want to bring it back, or do you want to try to get this through tonight? There's really, time is not of the essence right now. But
I think I could help wordsmith it to make it happen now.
Okay.
Even if you left the first sentence in and you left in all swimming pools shall comply with fencing requirements of this section, period. Enclosures on existing pools, and continue on. So the first sentence you take out existing at the time of passage of this chapter. So you just have all swimming pools shall comply with the fencing requirements of this section, period, and then move on to section 2. Because above is where you define what the swimming pool definition is already. So I think you're just saying they all have to comply. It's just really a compliance statement.
Is everyone comfortable with that?
Are you comfortable with the idea that you've covered all existing pools and you don't have anybody that's gonna look back at this and say, this doesn't apply to me? Because my pool was in effect before?
Michael, you and I had a conversation about this before, and as I recall, you thought all of them were captured already.
Yeah, I think so.
Because one alternative, I guess, would be to say all swimming pools, comma, including those in existence at the time of passage, must comply. You know, just as a sort of fail-safe.
There you go. See, we're getting better at this by the second.
Yeah, if I could only figure out how to type on a PDF, I could change it.
And then I like that, the way it's going, but I have one question. If I had a pool that was 36 inches or less, I mean, do we need to somehow rule those out? Because up under enclosure, it says pools within the scope of this section.
If they're under 36 inches, they wouldn't apply. They don't meet the definition of they're an exempt pool.
As a
Exempt.
pool? Okay, so we don't have to deal with them because they're a different case.
Right.
Oh.
If they can't hold 36 inches of water, they wouldn't be classified as a pool.
All right, are there any other sections that anyone had concerns about? All right, and Rodney, did you capture the language change that was proposed? Because I didn't.
I think we've got it. We can
Yeah.
also look back on it, but the way I understood it was gonna be all swimming pools existing at the time of passage of this, no, correct? Yes.
Including.
All
Including,
swimming pools included, all
Yeah.
swimming pools, comma, included.
Yeah.
Mhm.
pools existing at the time of passage of this chapter
Comma.
shall comply with fencing requirements of this section.
All right, anybody willing to make a motion with those changes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, any more discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
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 And any opposed? None opposed. So that'll go to the council sometime in January. Mike, certainly if you see anything between now and then, let us know. And thanks for your help. All right, item number 7 is a request by Phil Harrison to discuss the regulations for flags and banners used for commercial signage. This one we had talked about on November 9th. Anything to update here, Director Shield?
Yeah, recall this hasn't been placed for a public hearing. We're still trying to craft some language that would go to a public hearing at hopefully our next meeting. But what we did in the draft language at this point, we put in an allowance, if you will, 78. So if you scroll down to page 7 of this document, Mayor, there's a draft ordinance within here. So this page here offers some language where we acknowledge what we're calling feather flags as being allowed. For business districts, each lot is allowed 1 feather flag per business with a maximum height of 12 feet, a maximum width of 3 feet. Feather flags shall be removed when business is not open. So the intent is at the end of each business day, that sign would come down and it would be reinserted or replaced out there when they reopen the next day. The size, not completely arbitrary, but we did look at some commercially available signs similar to this and tried to accommodate what we thought was a reasonable size. Again, just as a starting point for the commissioners to discuss a little bit. When we get to a level of satisfaction, we'd certainly take it to public hearing for additional testimony and for future consideration by the commission as well.
Any
And
initial thoughts?
Commissioners can help correct us, or you participated in the discussion last time. this was the tone of what I thought I heard from the dialogue. And certainly we can modify to shape it differently if that's the desire of the commission.
If I can have a minute, I'm not going to vote on this one, but I do have some thoughts on the content, because I thought about it more. And I'm thinking that, I mean, this is really close, but I'm thinking that it might be even better to say, instead of where we have each lot is allowed one feather flag per business, because the more I think about it, there are a number of buildings on some lots, particularly if this pertains to even the downtown district as well, or places like it, that you could end up with too many. And so I think it might be sufficient to just say each parcel is allowed one feather flag per street frontage. And I could see where if you had multiple businesses in that building, that one open sign would be enough to let everyone know that the building is open. Or if the feather flag was going to highlight a product like coffee, then the businesses could rotate, because you're taking the sign in and out every night based on the ordinance. That one day it could highlight the coffee of one business, and one day it could highlight the ice cream of a different business, or salon, or whatever it might be. And that would reduce the concern that people have about too much clutter, with that could potentially result from an ordinance like this. I do, in addition to maybe potentially tweaking that language in terms of the quantity of feather flags, some questions that came up for me is whether we need to define business districts. If they're defined somewhere else in the ordinance clearly, what that is it any building that is zoned commercial, or are there specific districts that have been specified besides the downtown Main Street Historic District?
We don't have a commercial zoning district. We have planned business districts, neighborhood business districts. So we have our zoning classification uses the word business in them, as opposed to a commercial title.
So it is clear based on the planned business zoning classification that if this says for business districts, it is referring to that?
It would in my interpretation, it would accommodate any of our zoning classifications that utilize business in the title. Neighborhood business, planned business, those are the primary ones that, and downtown central business. All three of those districts are what I would interpret as being allowable under this business classification.
Okay, good. Just so it's somewhere it's clear, because otherwise, as a commission, we won't know which ones it applies to. The last thing I think we might want to add is something with respect to the location. Are we concerned about where those, in the downtown, the way it's been used so far, there's the clear holes in the pavement where the feather flag goes. So it's pretty much set where those flags will be. And if they want to put a flag without one of those holes, they have to have a stand that's in line with the other holes in the pavement. Now that we're just applying it to all business districts, is there any thought that by commissioners on, does the feather flag have to be on the inside of the sidewalk? Does it have to be on out of the right of way? We might need to specify something with respect to the location.
Here, I think I can clarify that. So really, all flags need to be on private property.
Okay.
So they would have to be on private property. There is the exception. This is the zoning code and regulates signs on private property.
Okay.
Your reference to the locations for the downtown historic district, there is special provisions that allow their placement to be within the right of way under a separate ordinance. So those regulations would still apply to placement of those in a very narrow, downtown district.
Okay.
All these other locations would have to be on private property.
So would anywhere on private property be okay, or does it have to be outside the view triangles, or like at intersections where like on my property, if I put one in the corner, still on the sidewalk on my property, it might be within the triangle that's supposed to be reserved for turn lanes and everything else.
Couldn't be placed there. There's still a prohibition for signs within a vision triangle.
Okay,
So that would still be consistent with any sign. So
Okay.
the overall standards of placement would still apply and protect that vision triangle.
and that's somewhere else within the code that we're not looking at?
Yep.
Okay, Then I'm
It's in-
cool.
It is, yep. Those are good comments and suggestions to be mindful of. Now, tonight, we're not actually asking for a motion to approve it. We're trying to wordsmith it to a certain degree where we take it to public hearing. So if there's, changes tonight and or now and all the way through adoption by council, they can still be made. But certainly just trying to take this to the next step where it would go to a public hearing.
Can I just throw out there that I would be cautious about treating business owners differently? So while I understand and hear the concern about potential clutter, we just want to make sure we aren't putting the city in the position of treating a business owner who happens to be on a lot where 3 businesses are located differently than a business owner who's on a lot with 1 business, and forcing them to buy a permit and then not be able to use it to the full extent.
That's
So-
that's a valid point.
Yeah,
Then
in
you,
practice, how would you do that, I guess? I mean, I think part of the goal is, we don't want to have one on top of another, so you can't read any of them. But we do want to be able to allow them to anybody that wants to have one.
so I think in the downtown district, and I'll have to refer to this separately. Again, that's where we allow placement of, I believe it's only 1 per parcel in front of, within the right of way, and that's controlled because it's placed within the right of way. Is that right, Michael? I think it's 1 per parcel, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's supposed to be just that, say, for open signs, but
Yeah.
yeah. That has to be wordsmithed a bit too.
Rachel, do you see a problem with us limiting it to just open signs? I know there's at least one that says something other than that, and I'm guessing there'll be requests for others as well.
Right. Well, that starts walking down the road of content restrictions, and that's definitely a First Amendment issue. So I know we've talked about the potential of reworking your sign ordinance more holistically, with case law in mind, specifically Reed v. Gilbert, which talks about content-based restrictions. And I think we would definitely want to look at that with your whole sign regulation structure in mind. Right now, what you're doing is not, by just touching feather flags without addressing their content, you're not really walking down that treacherous First Amendment road. But if you wanted to start saying, well, you can only have signs that say open, you're walking down that road.
Question, are we expecting these feather flags to be permitted? I mean, does it have to go through your office each time someone wants to put out a flag? Or is it automatically allowed based on the ordinance?
As structured, it would require a permit.
Permit.
There were a few exceptions, but for the most part, in the business district, it would.
And that's somewhere else in the ordinance where it specifies that you need to have the permit? Because I don't see it anywhere here in what is before us.
Yeah, so chapter 78 is the zoning code. Chapter 810 is just the construction standards for the sign, the standards related to signs. The entire structure related to signage requires permits. As the mayor indicated, there are some exceptions to the permit requirements. This is not one of the exceptions.
Okay.
Yeah, it's section 1 at the piece that's on our screen right now is at the end of that where it just says any other similar sign shall be permitted except. That what you're looking for, Todd?
Yeah,
Permitted in this word, in this sentence means allowable, not issuance of a permit.
Ah,
Permitted.
yeah.
I was reading it as permitted, as in needing a permit.
I can see how you could read that, but it's really intended to say, it shall be allowed is really what
All right.
it means in this context.
Yep.
All right, any other thoughts or anything that we might want to consider before we move on?
We'll plan to move this to a public hearing for further refinement and consideration.
All right. Next item is discuss potential zoning code amendments to allow mobile food vending on private property. And this one we've talked about in the past as well. And I believe we did some work on this one. Would you like to highlight that, Director Shield?
Yeah, I think one of the primary reasons we bought, Rachel's been involved in this a great deal with us, and having worked also with the Community Affairs Council Policy Task Force, or Public Safety Committee, I believe, related to licensing. And so I think it would be good to have Rachel give kind of just a quick background as to how this has morphed from requiring an additional license to just being a permitting process and managed through the zoning code as opposed to being a license and a zoning code issue.
Sure. So when this was originally discussed, we talked about the issue of licensing this activity, recognizing that would be in addition to regulating through the zoning code, because this is arguably a type of land use and would need to be permitted by the zoning code in order to properly exist. And that took us to a place where I think there was just generally discussion about not wanting to essentially have duplicative supervision and oversight. So if you have a licensing category, you've got a group of people having to take a look at stuff and give approval, and then you also need zoning approval, and you probably have sometimes even looking at something twice. So the general impression is, at least where we've landed so far, is that regulation of food trucks can essentially be done through the zoning code, which is why it's before you now. The version of the ordinance that you have actually touches on 3 different things. So it defines mobile food vending, but the first thing you'll really see that it addresses is temporary outdoor sales, which is something that you already had in your zoning code, but it seemed like there was a bit of a desire to clean that up a little bit and to distinguish it from food trucks, from mobile food vending. So we've adjusted it to be a little more clear based on some feedback we've received. And we've added several requirements to it. The idea being that in order for someone to engage in temporary outdoor sales, they need to get approval of use of a particular site, and that they'll be limited in what they can do and the amount of time they have to engage in that activity. Temporary outdoor sales was sort of thought of as your summer vegetable vendors, your fireworks vendors, people that'll set up in a parking lot for a time, but generally for a short period of time. Then this addresses specifically mobile food vending. So this would be, it's similar to temporary outdoor sales, but because we're defining it specifically, it's different than under the zoning code, and it's its own thing. This is the retail sale of food and beverages to the general public. So right now, the way this ordinance is drafted, it doesn't contemplate regulating use of food trucks that are privately engaged. The zoning code just wouldn't address that. It wouldn't speak to it. But this is set up right now to say that mobile food vending can operate in any zoning district except in the central business district, which I believe is your downtown area, and not in residential districts. And then it allows or requires someone to have approval from the zoning administrator and get a permit for every cart. This is different from the temporary outdoor sales regulation right now, because the way the outdoor sales regulation is set up is it limits someone to one activity per year, and that's something I noted and wanted to address with you all and make sure that's something that reflects your intent and is what you would want. When we're talking about food carts, a vendor could have more than one and be permitted more than one, but it's based on the number of carts they have. And then we need to keep in mind that because we're doing this through zoning, it's really about multiple sites. They would need approval of each site or each place where they want to set up shop. And then sort of the third category of activity regulated here are food trucks at special events. And special events are specifically defined in your code chapter 14. Those are events that are actually located on the public right of way or on public premises, which is very different than the other regulation of food trucks that we're authorizing here. Food trucks could set up shop on public property if they got permission from the city, but otherwise this contemplates using private property. We wouldn't be allowed up on the public right of way as this is currently drafted. They are required to maintain all health and safety standards and licensing established by Dane County or the state, or both, depending on how they're regulated, but that pulls the city out of having to separately make sure that they're complying with health codes. And we do have this set up right now to say that food trucks need to stay 500 feet away from other special events. I don't know if that was from Plan Commission or if that was from the CACP. Or I don't even know what your commitments are. I apologize. I think I may have messed that up. But the idea was to be a little bit protective of special events and to not let someone sort of set up shop and take advantage of an existing special event without being part of it. So one thing to keep in mind as you look at this is it's not complete. Section 2 of this ordinance as currently drafted does note that once we've settled on which districts are acceptable, where you would like this activity to occur and not to occur, then we need to go in and amend section 105 of chapter 78. Just in every place where a zoning district is listed, we need to add mobile food vending to it if that's a district you'd like that activity to occur in, or you would okay allowing it to occur in. So that's sort of a very high level overview of what you have before you. Happy to help answer any questions or work through some things.
Thank you, Rachel. Any initial thoughts from commissioners?
Rachel, I know one of the things that we talked about at length in the CACP committee was around the residential zone, residential districts in there. We were trying to come to terms with if someone decided that they wanted to hire a food vendor to come and cater a party, a wedding party, graduation party, a whatever it is. This one would then, it wouldn't be allowed under this wording. Is that correct?
Well, it's a good question. So one way to interpret this is we've defined what mobile food vending is to mean using a food truck essentially to sell to the general public. So arguably, a food truck that's rented for a private party is not available to sell to the general public. If
I see,
that's the
okay.
case, then we're in a space where your ordinances simply don't talk about that activity. So the city could essentially choose to let that go and just say that's not an activity that requires a permit under our zoning code. The alternative, though, if somebody wanted to press it, is to say, hey, your ordinances are set up to say that a particular activity is allowed, and therefore it's not allowed anywhere it's not expressly permitted. So one option would be to be a little more explicit in your code about this activity being like that this doesn't prohibit the private rental of mobile food trucks or something like that. But if you're comfortable knowing you're not going to seek enforcement action against someone who goes and privately rents a truck, then I think you're okay as this is currently set up.
I mean, I guess I can see like maybe just to have a note like you suggested that it doesn't apply to things hired for a private use. So or just maybe to really emphasize that it has to be open for public consumption, wide public consumption, because I'm sure that we'll get an inquiry about something like that. So I mean, if we could just get a note in there somewhere, that would clarify one way or the other with that. And I think that would settle it out.
Yeah, I think the concern for the private use was traffic, and especially if it was parked in the public right of way in front of somebody's house.
Yep. Doesn't prevent ice cream trucks, right?
Those are licensed separately.
That's right, yeah.
And did you have
All right, go
something,
ahead.
Commissioner Barwin?
I do, a couple things. I'll be honest with you, I'm having a couple, I'm having some challenge in terms of how we're splitting this off from the temporary use regulations versus the mobile food vending. Because there's so much redundancy between the two forms. I mean, a lot of the bullets under each are the same exact for both. And I'm wondering, I'm not exactly clear in my head why we have to have two separate ones. Because in a lot of ways, it's really trying to define the difference between a special event kind of vending environment versus the more portable or mobile kind of vending event and the fixed building store throughout the community. And I think it's somewhat confusing and arbitrary to specify the kinds of temporary outdoor sales we have versus mobile food vending, in part just because it's not clear to me what the difference is, because if we're just talking about the fact that one is in a truck and the other is not, then the issue can be much broader than that. If you look at some of the truck vending or vehicular vending that's going on in places even as close as Madison, there's businesses that have set up dress shops out of a mobile vending truck. In the way we define food vending, it almost looks like it's processed food. Well, how does that apply to like the seafood truck that's here in town that is just selling frozen seafood that's been processed elsewhere? It's more of like a farmer's market kind of vending than it is a food processing truck. And so to me, it's just, it's a little bit confusing how we've broken this up into the different categories, how we're defining the categories and why they need to be separate. Because in my head, it really, they could just be combined with the caveats that any particular vendor has to abide by other state regulations for licensing. So if it happens to be a food vendor that's processing food, then they're required to make sure that they have all the health permits they need. Or if they are a farmer's market vendor, then they need to have all the permits they need to be able to sell fresh grown produce. I'm not sure why it is that we need the two separate sections broke out. And then I think it opens up holes.
Well, I think there's a distinction between what the mobile food vending offers as opposed to the temporary uses. You know, the temporary sale for outdoor sales, you know, the examples are, you know, garden shop sales, fireworks, vegetable, fruit sales, Christmas tree sales, whereas the mobile food vending are related to food which is cooked, wrapped, packaged, processed, or proportioned for services, sale, or distribution. So it's really more of a targeted vendor as opposed to the more broad topics or types of vendors that reside seasonally in many cases.
Well, I'm just saying, let's say I'm the women's dress truck, and I'm looking to set up my, not a temporary, not just a one weekend. I actually want to have my mobile vending vehicle, not food. I want to sell jewelry out of my truck. I want to sell on a more permanent basis. I want to sell clothing. I mean, are we disallowing them because they're not food? They're not they're not processing food, and they're not temporary enough for us?
I don't think they'd fall under the mobile food vending, that's for sure. They'd have to be followed under the temporary outdoor sales, potentially.
Yep.
And evaluated as such.
So why are we I just don't understand. Then why do we have, if you could sufficiently deal with someone who is selling clothing out of a truck under the temporary use, I don't understand why we have to break out mobile food vending in particular, if all you're essentially doing is saying you got to make sure you have your permits in place for health code requirements, or your licensing in place for health code requirements. If we can deal with other mobile food or mobile vendors, mobile truck vendors, truck retailers under the temporary outdoor sales, I don't understand why we break out a whole separate category that essentially repeats 90% of the bullets and then just adds a couple.
So I was assuming these two categories as being like the broader first one with all of the different types of businesses that you could be selling things as the large catch-all, and then the food cart was broken out of that group as that one's intended for immediate consumption foods versus any of the other ones. All the other categories don't necessarily, I mean, yes, I understand you can eat a vegetable or a fruit standing right there, but that's not necessarily always true. So I think it's about the matter of what the time of consumption is going to be. And I think the food carts are explicit in that is immediate consumption.
But I guess I would challenge and say, why does that make a difference from a code perspective? If we're not the ones licensing to make sure that the food is healthy, so that the people who are immediately consuming it are safe, if that's not the responsibility of the city of Stoughton, then why do we have to break out that special category because of immediate consumption? It doesn't make sense to me. Why don't we just make sure that we're handling all the different kinds of general temporary. And again, I'm not even sure I like the word temporary in the sense that it's more of an issue of them being portable, mobile. But that's another argument. But I don't understand why we can't deal with that aspect of it. Because if the land use side of it is what we're dealing with within our code, then let's deal with the land use issue of placement of any kind of vending and leave the licensing of the health requirements of the immediate consumption foods to those appropriate agencies.
What gets to, it's good discussion. I think the commissioners in the city are gonna have to determine what level of temporary portable vendors they want in their community and how they want to regulate them. And whether they're a food provider, a jewelry provider, a clothier, however they want to evaluate those, we'd have to understand what the guidelines are that the commission wants to have on them. Are we going to do a site plan review for every one of them? Is the turnover or frequency of a mobile food vending cart higher than maybe the jeweler that was referenced or somebody? I don't know. Are those different standards that you then evaluate based on that? Because we're going to have to really understand what the commission would like to regulate or how they'd like to regulate the different vending opportunities. I'm not as familiar with the portable, selling stuff as much out of the back of the car type thing as I am, the food cart type arrangements. I'm not saying they don't happen, but it seems like they're more prevalent. The portable cart of food vendors are.
Yeah, and I think if you were to put the two sections side by side, there are a lot of similarities. There's some distinction on hours of operation. There's distinction on, making sure that the licensing, I think, is a little more stringent on the food carts through Dane County than they would be, say, on a vegetable stand. There's a distinction on the signage. But there are a lot of similarities, so I certainly understand your point, Todd, that you're making. And then the other big one is, I think, the district where you're setting them up. With food carts, I think that part of the thought is we, in the downtown district especially, we didn't really want to compete with the brick and mortar restaurants in particular. And with some of the other things, the brick and mortars they're not selling fireworks at any of them currently, or, they're not selling some of the items that you would typically see seasonally in the brick and mortar shop. So I think those are the main distinctions, but you're right, there are a lot of similarities there. And we might be able to, if we do leave them separate, we might be able to just focus on the differences and not make it so redundant. Or if you wanted to consolidate them, you could highlight the exceptions for the food carts if you feel there should be any. So, I think you could do it a couple different ways.
One thing to keep in mind, just sort of a flip side to the argument, is that even if the city itself is not regulating the health code things, for example, specifically, failure to comply is a reason for the city to rescind any approvals.
Certainly,
Many
I
of those
think
requirements. So that's just something to note, that it might be worth at least including in your ordinance, even if you don't maybe keep it separate from other things, or if you don't proactively regulate it yourself, because if you become aware that there's non-compliance, it's certainly a reason for the city to say, well, all right, you particular vendor, you can't engage in that activity here anymore.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree. I think that bullet that talks about a mobile food vendor must comply with all food preparation and sanitation regulations, that kind of wording needs to be in there. But you don't need to have a whole separate length of code pulling food vendors out just to be able to state that. So that could be a bullet under the temporary use. I will also just throw out, it's because the question is going to come up about the 180 days. Because that's less than half the year. And what happens for, this was in part stimulated by the coffee vendor who wants to be operating 365 days a year. And according to the way everything's worded here, they could only operate those 180 days and would have to wait for the duration of the rest of the year to expire before they could apply again, even
Correct.
to have a different location. And it says here that they can't even have another location within the community. They have to only have 180 days per year. And I think that's going to come up as a question in any kind of public hearing. But I also know that I've worked in communities where one of the mainstay or nostalgic operators within a downtown district would be the hot dog cart or the popcorn vendor or the roasted chestnuts this time of year that in some cases it's those what we consider temporary that become more permanent, that become a more of a mobile push cart or kiosk kind of business that really actually adds to the business mix downtown. I know there's always so much concern about, well, we don't want to have the incorrect or a mobile competitor to a fixed storefront business within the downtown. But in a lot of cases, it's good to have the critical mass and more businesses versus less from a business perspective. So even from the extent within a downtown district, I wouldn't do it on Main Street, but having on the side streets, I mean, if my daughter would love it if I'm trying to remember, if it's FFA that has the cheese curd stand that's usually set up next to where City Hall is now on, my daughter would love it if they were there every day of the year. She would go get the deep fried cheese curds. But, if for some cases on the side streets, having a mobile food vendor that becomes at a fixed location can actually enhance the downtown district. So I just throw that out there as being food for thought as as the commission thinks about this kind of ordinance.
You might remember the last meeting, the 180, there was discussion about 90 days or 180, that the numbers was placed in there just based on the conversation we heard at the last commission meeting. So these are subject to your change and your recommendations, because ultimately we're looking to take this to public hearing and then ultimately to council before it would be adopted.
Any other thoughts or ideas on this one? I mean, like I said, we could certainly look at trying to just consolidate it under one group of bullet points and then have maybe the last group of them specified for the food carts, the ones that apply to only the food carts, and list them at the end and say all the rest of the standards are regardless of whether they're a food cart or any other type of temporary use. If you think that would be cleaner, we could certainly do that rather easily, or we could come back with a side by side so you can see the differences. But I think that some of the other points you made, I think that's just something that, at the public hearing, if people show up, it'll be interesting to get that feedback. And then ultimately, you'll have to make a recommendation and see what the council wants to do with it. When it was at CACP, what we started out with an ordinance, and we've really already gotten it down to a much smaller, more manageable document by going to zoning. There was some feedback at the time from the chamber as well, representing some of the current business owners. And really at the time, we didn't have any particular vendors that were interested in doing this. So, maybe the market is changing. Certainly, some examples in other communities that are comparable to Stoughton, we could look around, especially in Dane County. I don't really know any off the top of my head, of our size, but I can do some research on that as well if you think that'll help.
I think consolidating the language down would make the document a lot cleaner, shorter. So that seems like a reasonable way to go. I think one other thing, when we were discussing the 90 to 180 days, I think the only reason we decided on the 180 days is that it otherwise it's not necessarily temporary if it's running 365.
But I think that's a question to have in mind for potential distinction between the kind of temporary, like vegetable stands and fireworks stands that are definitely contemplated by your temporary outdoor sales regulation, and potentially the concept of a food truck that might operate year round. And I don't know that you necessarily want to allow that, but if you do, that's one more reason to keep these things separate, because you really are potentially treating them differently. And just as a consumer of the law, if I'm looking to maybe run a food cart myself, it might be easier for me to understand what the requirements are if everything that applies to me is in one place. And I'm not trying to peel out, well, that applies if I'm a vegetable stand, but I'm a food truck, so I also have this other thing. So just food for thought that keeping them distinct and labeled as distinct activities could provide some value for just understanding, especially if we do reach a place where some of these other things are subject to change for food trucks, but not for other kinds of vendors. Then a lot of that is really based on your policy choices.
All right, I would suggest if anybody thinks of anything between now and the next meeting, maybe shoot Rodney or myself an email and we'll include it into our discussion. I imagine we'll have some further conversations with Attorney Schneider as well, maybe try to get some other examples of other communities, if there's any out there. Any last thoughts on this one?
Well, do we need a policy firmed up before we can have a public hearing? Is that the idea, or is it the public hearing is to get feedback from those who would be potentially using it?
We certainly want feedback. You do not have to have the language set in stone before it goes to public hearing. You want that public testimony. We're trying to refine the position of the Plan Commission to some manageable level before you get to a public hearing, so that you formulated some thoughts about what you see as a group as maybe being appropriate to present to the community.
Okay.
So if we're not at that point, we won't take it to a public hearing at the next meeting. If you feel we are at a point where this should be taken to the public hearing, we can do that.
I think if we had something like the consolidated version, and then as council suggesting the completely broken out version of it, and then see what the opinion is about which one. I mean, I can see merits on both sides of it. One would be cleaner, easier to read. The other one would be, and the con to that would be you'd have to parse a bunch of things out and whether it applies to you specifically. But with it all broken out, then we would have the ability to, we don't have to necessarily consider other parts of the zoning if we're only going to focus in on something and change something related to food vendors. So then everything is all packaged off in one space.
So if you would like a consolidated version, would you like that version to still keep food trucks out of the central business district?
I believe
Because
so.
your temporary sales right now are permitted in all business districts, but food trucks would not be.
Okay, then let's not go down the consolidated route then, because then that just starts to complicate things a little bit too much in there. But I know we don't want to have the food trucks running in central district.
All right, sounds like we need to get some feedback, so maybe we just put it on for a public hearing and see what happens. And if we don't get enough feedback or we have direction, we can always come back and, if we're not ready to make a decision the night of the public hearing.
Can we run a prompt through the Chamber of Commerce also so that we could maybe get some folks that might be interested in this present so that we can actually get some good feedback from them, what they're looking for?
Sure.
To give them a heads up of the public hearing is what you're suggesting?
Yes.
I'll just, okay. I got it. Just a couple of things though. I would think that if you're going to keep it as two separate, you might want to consider, because it sounds like the issue is not just that they're vending processed food or they're processing food and selling it like a restaurant. It is that it's a more permanent fixture. And so you might want to, rather than have that second section that you're breaking off, deal with uses that would be at a more fixed location for longer periods of time versus what you're considering to be much more temporary, like Christmas tree sales. If you're looking for an example of a different type of vending truck, I did find, as I was searching here, the one that was in Madison, I don't know if they're still operating, it was called Grasshopper Goods. Grasshopper-Goods. It's a mobile boutique. And you can look at, they have pictures of their truck and what they sell. And I also ran across, it looks like there's a couple articles where Madison was running into issues of how to deal with them from a code perspective too. So there might be some stuff there that they had to come up with.
Yeah, and they're actually a brick and mortar in our downtown now. So they transitioned from food cart or to a cart to a brick and mortar. So, and we could talk to them as well. I mean, they might be good ones to talk to about it. All right, should we move on?
Sure.
All right, so the next two items are regarding requests for some annexation. The first one is for 1.152 acres of land from the town of Rutland on Highway 138 West. And Director Shield, do you want to walk us through this one?
So this actually is a parcel of land that yet remains in the town that would really be the position of the southerly leg of the roundabout that's on 138 at the entrance to the Walmart commercial center area. This property is surrounded essentially by Stoughton Utilities property. As part of the development agreement and the TIF agreement language that was put together as part of the Kettle Park West second phase, or the third phase, however you want to look at it. There was an expectation to move this forward through the annexation process. The landowner has submitted that petition. It's consistent with our comprehensive plan. It is found to be in the public interest by the Department of Administration and is recommended for annexation.
Any thoughts or questions about this one? All right, I'm not hearing any thoughts or questions. So I guess I would entertain a motion for this one then for approval.
I'll make the motion to, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Tom.
I'll make that motion to approve it.
Then I'll second it.
All right, any discussion on it? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
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 And any opposed? None opposed, that carries. The next one is for just over 4 acre piece of land from the township. And this one here, I believe this is part of the parkland, isn't it?
Correct.
Okay, this should be it here.
Just a quick overview. This piece of land helps address the additional parkland necessary for the residential component of the Kettle Park West development. It's been articulated as part of the agreements that we have in place with the development community to bring this forward to attach this piece of property to the city. And you'll note it is actually adjacent to the land that's already dedicated to the city as part of the parkland. So it would expand the park going to the west. That's recommended for adoption.
And any questions or comments on this one? And then the hopes would be is if this development continues to grow, that we would be able to add additional parkland and as we go to the west. And so it's an interesting piece of property. There's some slope there. There's some wooded area nearby. So we think this is gonna really make for a nice park and a nice trail system going through here. Any questions or comments, or I'll entertain a motion for this one.
I'll make the motion to annex this property.
Is
I'll
there a
second.
second?
I'll
Okay,
second.
thank you. And last call, any discussion on this one? Hearing none, all in favor, say
Actually,
aye. Oh,
Hey,
go
Tim,
ahead.
hang on a sec,
All
if
right,
you don't mind. I'm just kind of curious, and I don't think there is, since it's not in the city of Stoughton, but is there, with consideration of development going forward and the potential of additional parkland to the west of this, is there anything that can be done that sort of, like I said, I don't think we can guarantee or anything, or is there any way to sort of preserve any access to the west for parkland uses going forward?
I know there's been some conversation about that, and I don't know if somebody from the development team wants to touch on that. Are they still on this call here?
Yeah, this is Dennis. I'm on. And we have always looked at how this area will get expanded to the west or south. And we still have expectations of looking into being able to do that down the road here. And I think what we're doing up to this point certainly allows us to continue to expand in either one or both of those directions.
Does that answer your question, Alderperson Caravello?
I think so, to the extent that it can be at this point, most likely, yeah.
Yeah, and I would say as we get further along in the process here and they get closer to doing some work, I think we'll probably be having some more conversations. And certainly, there's going to be some, other approvals needed, and we can continue this conversation, I guess, at that point, if that's something you'd like to do.
Yep.
Any other questions or comments on this one? I think we had a motion, right, in a second?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All in favor of this one, say aye.
Aye.
I
And any opposed? That motion carries. I think that's all we had on for tonight. Future agenda items, anything out there, Director Shield?
Not currently in the works. I mean, one of the outline topics is the overall sign code. We did talk about really having to dig into that, but we know that that's a 1 to 2 year process. So that is something on our radar that we'll have to really dig into and try to vet through that going forward. Yeah,
and the other thing I'll add is Attorney Schneider is also working on something more permanent for the outdoor dining. Right now, we're allowing it on Main Street under an emergency order, and the council did extend that until the end of May. So I don't know if that's something that's going to come through this committee or if it's going to go somewhere else. I don't know if we really decided that yet. But that may come here. I don't know what your thoughts are, Rodney.
Yeah, there's probably aspects of that that will come through the zoning code regulations. So there will be aspects of that that we'll see here. Another topic that will come through the plan commission is in January, we expect to have a discussion about the urban service area amendment related to the Dvorak development, Velcomen Way, Highway 51 area being brought into the urban service area. So we anticipate having that on the agenda in January as well.
So it looks like, we had a good year this year. I appreciate all the extra time that you put into, there was some longer meetings this year than in previous years. But I think that we really accomplished a lot. If you just drive around town, whether it's, up toward Culver's, or you go out by Stoughton Trailers, or you go down N and head over to the business park north, there's a lot of activity going on, and it's because of the time and effort you guys put into that. And I'm really, pleased with the outcome and the work that y'all did. So thank you for that.
I'm certainly impressed by all of the infill on a lot of the empty lots that have been around, and that's residential, commercial, everything. So it's good to see.
Definitely. So, and, those aren't always easy to fill, especially, given, we're in the middle of a, COVID and a recession, and it's been a little bit cumbersome as far as trying to work efficiently. But I know that Michael and Rodney have really, put in a lot of extra time and effort on their part as well. So I certainly appreciate that.
Definitely.
All right, so that's all we had for tonight. I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
So
Got it.
moved.
All right, is there a second?
Sure.
Flip a coin.
We'll let Michael decide. All in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
I oppose.
There's one in every crowd. All right, everybody have a good holiday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, folks.